Today I'm going to read through the last couple sections from Whistling Vivaldi and Other Clues to How Stereotypes Affect Us by Claude Steele. I became an expert on the language of fear. Couples locked arms or reached for each other's hands when they saw me. Some crossed to the other side of the street. People who were carrying on conversations went mute and stared straight ahead as though avoiding my eyes would save them. I'd been a fool. I'd been walking the streets grinning good evening at people who were frightened to death of me. I did violence to them just by being. How had I missed this? I tried to be innocuous, but didn't know how. I began to avoid people. I turned out of my way onto side streets to spare them the sense that they were being stalked. Out of nervousness, I began to whistle and discovered I was pretty good at it. My whistle was pure and sweet and also in tune. On the street at night, I whistled popular tunes from the Beatles and Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The tension drained from people's bodies when they heard me. A few even smiled as they passed me in the dark. So as I read this, I'm keeping in mind that the person who is writing this is talking about his experience as an African American man in Chicago, and the fear that some people had as they saw him because of the stereotype of what African American men are. Their stereotype, it sounds like, was of someone who is frightening and potentially violent, and that stereotype obviously does not fit him, but it affects him. It makes him feel a certain way about himself, and he, instead of just avoiding people, he realizes that if he whistles classical music, people stop stereotyping him in the way that they would. So my main takeaway would be something like this. Staples, an African American man, started whistling classical music so that people wouldn't stereotype him as a violent person. Okay, moving on to the next section. Staples was dealing with a phantom, a bad stereotype about his race that was in the air on the streets of Hyde Park. The stereotype that young African American males in this neighborhood were violence-prone. People from their groups and other situations might face very different stereotypes about lacking math ability rather than being violent-prone, for example. But their predicament would be the same. When they were in situations where, and I'm moving down, flipping the page, where those stereotypes would apply to them, they understood that one false move could cause them to be reduced to that stereotype, to be seen and treated in terms of it, that stereotype threat, a contingency on their identity in these situations. So I'm pausing here and I'm thinking about what this is saying. Flipping back to the first page, it seems like the author is saying, describing and explaining that Staples is dealing with a bad stereotype, and he knows it. And he knows that there are certain situations where that stereotype is going to really change how people treat him. Go ahead and think of your takeaway. So as I think about my main takeaway, I feel like I can't really understand it unless I think of this word contingency. It says that stereotype threat is a contingency of their identity in these situations. I can't really get a good sense of what that word means in this context. I don't see very many context clues, so I have to go to the dictionary. So the dictionary I chose to go to was Longman's Dictionary of Contemporary English, and that's at Longman's dictionary.com, so you can actually look up Longman's dictionary online and you'll find it. And when I looked up contingency, this is what it said: an event or situation that might happen in the future, especially one that could cause problems. So if I go back to my reading, an event that could happen in the future that could cause problems. So I might replace the word contingency in my head with a problem in the future of their identity in these situations. Maybe an aspect, a problematic aspect of their identity in these situations. So in thinking about that little paragraph, I've come up with a takeaway, and my takeaway is this. In certain situations when you are being stereotyped, that stereotype really changes how you think about yourself and what you do in that situation. Okay, moving on. Unless, as Staples discovered, they devise a way to deflect it. Staples whistled Vivaldi, by his own account, a very good version of it. What would that do for him? Would it improve his attitude towards others on the street, make him more understanding? Probably not. What it did for sure was change the situation he was dealing with, and how it did this illustrates nicely the nature of stereotype. In a single stroke, he made the stereotype about violence-prone African-American males less applicable to him personally. He displayed knowledge of white culture, even high white culture. People on the street may not have recognized the Vivaldi he was whistling, but they could tell he was whistling classical music. This caused him to be seen differently, as an educated, refined person, not as a violence-prone African-American youth. Such youths typically don't walk down the street whistling classical music. While hardly being aware of it, people drop the stereotype of violence-prone as the lens through which they see him. This seemed less threatening. People didn't know who he is, but they know he isn't someone to fear. Fear fades from his demeanor. Staples himself relaxes. The stereotype in the air that threatened him is fended off. And the change in the behavior of those on the street and his own behavior reveals the power that a mere stereotype, floating in the air like a cloud gathering the nation's history, was having on everyone all along. Whistling Vivaldi is about the experience of living under such a cloud, an experience we all have, and the role such clouds play in shaping our lives and society. So one part that was a little confusing for me in this section is understanding when she says that he displayed knowledge of white culture, even high white culture. I'm not totally sure what she means here, but I think she means that classical music is stereotypically a very white thing to like. That's my assumption. And so I guess that means because he was whistling something that is so stereotypically white, and she says high white culture, so that makes me think of very privileged people. Automatically, people on the street started to treat him a little bit differently. So maybe that's going to be my takeaway. I might write something like this. Staples changed people's stereotypes by doing something that a wealthy, high-cultured white man might do. When he did this, people didn't judge him as a violent person anymore. Okay, tomorrow in your group, you will be looking at the main claim and the subclaims that this author is talking about, and you'll make a decision about what the claim and the subclaims are.